Thanks for listening to the Bearded Tog podcast, where our goal is to help you take your business from a dream to a sustainable business. Thanks so much for listening again. Today is a super cool day. So I know when a lot of people start their business, they're just thinking about, the legality of everything. How do I get registered? How do I file my taxes? What do I need to do? Am I an LLC or an S-Corp? And honestly, the questions and the links and everything online, you never know if it's accurate because anybody can write anything on the internet. And then also too, it's going to be very subjective to where you live. One thing is not going to fit the other, especially depending on the city, state, profession, legality, if you have insurance or not. And so this can be a really intimidating and confusing part of your business. And the most scary part is that a lot of people just skip it and they don't care, at least for the first year. And they try and get by, or they just assume that they should be an LLC because their mom was an LLC or something like that. And, I think it's always the best to prepare early and prepare when it's easy. And then that way it kind of will just be better off for you in the long run. I think it's the best case. And so today we have my friend and my lawyer who's helping me out with my own personal trademark stuff and a few other projects, Skyler Showell. And he's going to be on. He's a business lawyer. He helps nonprofits. He helps tech startups mostly, and entrepreneurs just like me and you, make sure that they're in the best spot for success when it comes to registering their business, getting everything set up. And he's got some great insight today. So I just wanted to share that with you. This is a more practical episode than some of the other ones. So definitely give this episode a listen and let me know what you think at the end. If you have any questions for Skyler, he actually offers his email address at the end and we'll gladly take all your questions, which is really cool. Usually that would be expensive, but he's open to anything. So make sure you listen to this episode and enjoy. Thanks. But man, so I want to talk about you. So I know I know that everybody knows that you are a business lawyer, and that's such a, a very vague concept. We know that you study law at least, and that you help businesses. But tell me a little bit more about what you do and maybe how you got into it.
Oh, sure. Wow. Well, what we do and what I do is, we solve problems, right? And we usually come at it from a legal perspective, at least initially or at the core. But because my practice and my firm's different than a lot of lawyers, we don't necessarily stop there. With our experience and what we can do, we can look into their business plans and the business matters that aren't purely legal, but that complement kind of what we're doing with the legal. And you're right, business law can be a big amorphous term. That can mean transactions, buying or selling a business or some particular asset. It can mean litigation or disputes. All that falls within it. We do, under the rubric of business law, there's technology, there's real estate, there's bankruptcy. So, yeah, different people define them different ways, but business covers a lot. It can cover things and often does, starting a business, whether that's on some bigger scale or vision or whether that's sort of the accidental side hustle and or freelancer. It really runs a gamut. It can be for-profit, nonprofit. So it covers a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. I know one thing too is a lot of people look at business lawyer as kind of like at least I know in my field that there's a gap between when you're first starting out and maybe when you think, oh, I should get a business lawyer. But in reality, I know business lawyers that help freelancers write a business plan. And I know that business lawyers help, businesses just research picking out a name and can we get the copyright for the business? And even very kind of good elementary things that unless you took business classes in school, like maybe I did, like you wouldn't necessarily know where to start. And so I know, it's the whole gamut. It can be something as big as like a merger and an acquisition or something as small as, hey, I need help applying for, like your employer identification number for taxes and stuff like that. So yeah, you guys do a wide array of stuff. What are you focusing on recently?
Recently, we've been doing a lot of setup or startup packages, and that would be determining, what type of entity would be best, whether that's an LLC or a partnership or corporation, an S-Corp, a benefits corp. The list goes on, and it's kind of alphabet soup as far as the choices. But they do matter, and there's a lot of misconceptions out there and a lot of bad info on forums and random things on the web that can just make you confused and sort of chase your tail. The truth is there are commonalities among businesses, especially in certain industries. But I really do believe that most, if not all, businesses are kind of like a snowflake. We've all heard that. But it is true. There are little differences, and some of those just have to do with the founder or the founders, their particular goals, their particular concerns. So right, that's why you want to be careful about kind of one template fitting everything. It generally doesn't.
Sure.
That's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. What's one kind of major misconception that you think of when it comes to LLC or S-Corp or, partnership?
Oh, wow. Where do I start? There's a few. One is that every small business should be an LLC automatically. That's a big misconception. I mean, sure, they tend to be, easier to set up and maintain and cheaper than a corporation, among other forms, but they're not automatically right for every little business. They often are, but there are exceptions. I'll give you some. For instance, if you have an investor, especially one that's passive, or a few investors, that generally is not going to be right for an LLC. I mean, there are exceptions and one can debate, but that's not an automatic case for an LLC. I have clients that do really high-tech, cool stuff for the government as contractors or subcontractors. And in that world, not necessarily a legal reason, but for various business reasons, sometimes an S-Corp is the way to go. So I think a lot of people say, okay, I'm small, therefore LLC. Not necessarily. You still want to spend a little bit of thought on that analysis. Another thing I hear, another big misconception is that if we're a startup dealing with technology, we need to put it on, we need to do all the legal work right at the beginning on what I call the unicorn path, the Facebook, the Google path, and that is get a C Corp, do stock options, all these things. All those things might be right for a tech startup. And if they are, they might be right at a later stage. But what you find sometimes is somebody that ends up creating a business that has a wonderful business and makes a great living, but doesn't kind of go that unicorn path necessarily, that they end up with a structure that may not be right, may be more hassle and complexity or cost than what they needed at that stage. So those are, there's other misconceptions too, but those are two I come across a lot.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, especially with the LLC. You could probably explain this better than I can, but essentially, at least I always hear kind of the negative thing that an LLC would protect you from, which is it kind of separates the person from the business or the individual from the business. And I think people get the impression that, especially for really small businesses, that an LLC is the right way to go. From back in the day, there being less digital organizations and less digital businesses, so say if you were a carpenter, of course you would want to be an LLC so that if something bad happened or, a floorboard was done poorly or something like that, then, if you were sued or liable to be sued, then you would be separated from the business and stuff like that. But yeah, with the introduction of digital businesses, it gets a lot more complicated, but I think it also is like a lot easier as well. So for me, I'm not an LLC per se, but I have a lot of business insurance to hopefully cover, liability and stuff like that as well,
Yeah, and you mentioned another asset of good risk management. So there's a couple sort of legs to the stool, if you will, or pillars. First of all is your behavior, right? Making good decisions, not doing shoddy work, not being dangerous, not just going out in the world and rubbing people the wrong way for the heck of it. Because let's face it, a lot of lawsuits, even if they have some legitimate things that are being sued on, a lot of times it has to do with disagreements or people feel slighted or disrespected. This can be a real component of lawsuits. So your behavior, how you comport yourself, is one leg of the stool. Another one is how you allocate or deal with risk in your key contracts, like your client agreement or your customer agreements. So contracts, you can allocate risk and put some limitations on your risk. Another is having that entity, whether it's an LLC, a corporation of whatever type, et cetera, that will tend to isolate you or insulate you from a lot of liability. And then you also mentioned insurance. That can be kind of like, if you think of a trapeze artist, that final net before the floor. So if you have all those things in place, or at least, all but one of those, you're going to tend to do better. And believe it or not, another misconception is that the degrees of protection from the various entities, the general risk protection, varies greatly. Generally, they're on par. An LLC, a corporation, they offer similar general protection and separation of you from the business. What drives the concerns about entity often have more to do with how they relate to one or more investors, how easy they are to maintain, formalities, expenses, structure, and quite frankly, a lot of tax issues.
Right. Absolutely. How did you get into becoming a business lawyer? Did you study different kinds of law, or what's been your experience so far?
Oh, sure. Wow. Well, in undergrad, I studied product or industrial design, cars, bikes, computers, watches, and business. And then I ended up going out into the business world, in particular in finance, in investment firms. After that, as a trader, as a legal executive in some investment firms, and kind of fell in love with business, finance, investing. And then eventually, after learning a lot there, went out on my own. And in law school, I studied business, technology, for the most part. And that all kind of led to just this awesome convergence of being able to bring all these things to bear. So, like I said, I can bring a business and design background to bear, even when I'm doing legal work for clients. They often come to me for the legal work, or that's the focus. But once they get to know me and the team, it's we say, hey, we can offer more than the average lawyer who maybe is only focused on purely the legal issues. Like, for instance, if we do copyright and trademark work, me having a design background, I can give intelligent comments on their logo, let's say. And it's kind of an added thing that clients like, even though they don't necessarily expect it from a lawyer. They kind of come to like it, to be honest.
Right. Absolutely. Now, I know some lawyers, if a freelancer or a small business is looking for kind of just having counsel at their fingertips, if you will, there's kind of a lot of lawyers will do like a package for a small business, and that includes just kind of like anything you would need to start up. That's like we kind of talked about, like a business name, business plan, or like reserving a domain name, creating your legal partnership agreement or LLC and stuff like that, and even too, submitting all the necessary like IRS forms and documenting the meetings, and even creating those contracts to use with the customers and clients. Do you find that that's common for you, and that is something that people should be looking into with a lot of business lawyers?
Well, sure. And I'd like to think that we're pretty open-minded and creative when it comes to the fees. For instance, the billable hour is classic. We don't really like it. I mean, we'll do it here and there. Like some instances, something completely exploratory where you don't know where the boundaries are, or the scope, or when a client insists upon it. But we actually prefer to do like flat fee, all laid out up front. Here's what's included. Here's what's not. We'll do for depending on the client, we may do, installment plans, or we'll even consider barter in some situations. So, yeah, I never want. One of the problems with like hourly is somebody might have a question and they don't know if it's important, so they hesitate to pick up the phone. And then I've had it happen where turns out it was a problem. Maybe they underestimated it, and later, we end up fixing it, and it costs the client more. So I really want, the client to be incentivized to just reach out and not worry about the billable hour. So yeah, that's why we do kind of, for this fee, just call us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's super useful, especially too, because people hear lawyer. And yeah, I mean, lawyers, can generate a lot of income, but at the same time, like we shouldn't be, as a small business, necessarily scared of reaching out to any lawyer. And especially if we do eventually hire a lawyer, shouldn't be worried to reach out thinking that it'll cost us an arm and a leg. That lawyer wants to help businesses and wants to, I feel like expand the horizons of the business. So no, I think that's super wise. I know a lot of people that are just like, they kind of like you said before, they'll spend a lot of times on forums and stuff like that. And there's decent advice, but like you said, every business is a snowflake, and there's not everybody's in your situation. When I started, I know I hired an accountant specifically because I was starting my business while in college, but used most of my room for my business, and then I was still paying off student loans, and so I had a very complicated situation, and that was unlike other businesses, and so I wanted to make sure that I was covered and safe to minimize risk in the long run, which is kind of the whole deal about doing this. So what are some other key things that small businesses, that a business lawyer can help out with that a small business might not know just about, and whether it's big or small, things that have been super useful that you found?
Sure. Like I said, if they're on the more holistic, comprehensive side, like my team and I, they can help with, like I said, the actual business plan document, co-owners agreements, entity selection, really any time. So at the start is a great time to have a lawyer, accountant, and other advisors involved. And then other times are when there's a significant change in the business. You're bringing on a partner, or a partner's leaving, or you're expanding into a new product or a new market or new area, or when you get in trouble, unfortunately. If someone's suing you, obviously that's a time to consult a lawyer. But I really enjoy the planning up front to try to minimize the chances of being sued and put things in place such that if you are sued, and it does happen, you can't avoid it 100% if you're out there doing business, that the risk is somewhat mitigated, or that the plaintiff suing maybe can't get as far as they could if you hadn't taken certain steps to prepare, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, one thing I read, somebody told me that business lawyers can also even help. A lot of times this feels like it's something an accountant would do, but business lawyers can even help with when they become audited by the IRS. Is that true?
It is, and there can be a little overlap between accountants and lawyers. If you're audited or in trouble with the IRS or the state tax office, that's a time when a lawyer can help step in, because on one hand, you're dealing with accounting issues, but you're getting into legal issues as well. And that's where ideally the lawyer and the accountant on your team would collaborate well, play nice together, which, some do more than others. We like to collaborate and do that. So yes, that's a good example of when they can both help you.
And another question for you, just off the top of my head, state tax and taxes for people who do services, taxes for people who do products, explain a little bit more about how that works. And I know that's going to be different for every state and maybe municipality, but maybe what's your guiding light there for any business that's doing either of those?
Sure. And that's something that's actually evolving, especially if you talk about online sales tax, which until recent years hasn't been so much a concern. The general rule is that if you provide a service, in most jurisdictions, generally you're not going to be taxed the way you are for a good or a product. Now, even that's evolving, right? And there's some legislation in the wings on that, but that's a general rule. Again, check with your accountant in your specific jurisdiction. But the one thing I do see people get tripped up who sell a tangible good or a product is, and I understand why, their first time through they get very confused naturally on resale and tax and who's collecting it, and putting a form with their wholesaler saying that, the tax exemption in the chain. In other words, you don't get taxed on a good like every link in the chain. If you buy it from someone like a wholesaler, and that the use or sales tax can be kind of complicated. So that's something. And speaking of that, a bigger issue, but it relates to that too, that I see people come to us for, is they say, well, I have a presence kind of in my home state where I do business, and then I'm kind of here where I live now, and I'm kind of in between. So should I sort of register in both places? Should I register in one and just announce my presence to the, to the state or the county in the other? And that is something, those are some of the things that you will never find good custom advice online, because those are real snowflake situations, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be a crazy situation for everybody that's kind of doing different things. And I know things are kind of complicated now for wedding photographers and other businesses when we do work in, I think last year I did work in 20 different states. And so, how do we handle that and stuff like that? Another thing that I've heard business lawyers are useful for, I mean, obviously we know you're useful, but I'm just trying to bring up different situations that I feel like small businesses would benefit from is, and maybe you've done this or experienced this before, but former employees or contractors, suing the business rather than a customer. I've heard those situations can be kind of complex. Have you ever dealt with anything like that, or what's kind of, like a prized example of those situations?
Sure. And something that is a big place to get tripped up when you're new, even your first kind of vendor contractor or your first employee in some jurisdictions, is whether they're 1099 as a contractor, whether they're a full-on employee with payroll tax. And that can be a bit of a minefield, because the simplest, cheapest thing to do, of course, is to categorize them as, a contractor, a vendor. And sometimes that's accurate, but the IRS may disagree with you. And there's a multi-factor test that isn't particularly intuitive. It's a little vague, unfortunately. It's not a bright line, like if you step over, it's this or that. And so I help, we help small businesses really make tough decisions about whether to categorize them as employees if they are by that multi-factor test, but then have the compliance, the extra burden and expense and taxes of doing that, or whether they can be a contractor and whether that's reasonable in light of that IRS test. So those can be tricky decisions. It requires some judgment because, like I said, the factors are a little fuzzy.
Yeah. Do you have any examples of that? So I know a lot of photographers, at least, we might hire an assistant once a month for 6 to 8 hours.
Yeah, I can talk from a high level about the factors. The problem is when it comes to actually applying it to the situation, then, that's a little trickier. But the gist is, what it boils down to is, do you have the right to control, someone say micromanage this person? Are they doing kind of your main line of work? Are you providing them the equipment? Are you telling them what you want as an end product? Or are you saying every day, over their shoulder, like, do it this way, do it that? I'll give you an example that's a little simplistic, but kind of gets the point across. If you have a bakery and you hire a pastry chef to come in, even 10 hours a week to bake the bread or the croissants or something, and, you supervise them there, you give them the oven, all the tools, that's an employee. And people get caught up in, well, it's only 10 hours a week. That doesn't really matter. What is not an employee, and this is obvious, but you're a bakery and you have a leaky pipe and you call in a plumber once, every so many months, whatever. And they come in, they have their own equipment. You just say you need it fixed. You're not over their shoulder telling them like, oh, no, I think that should be adjusted. Or, you're a baker. What do you know about plumbing? So those are the extreme cases that are clear. The problem is, in a small business, it often blurs. Like if you hire someone to sort of get your process organized or your bookkeeping, well, that might very well be a consultant. But if you have someone an hour or two a week to kind of be your bookkeeper, to answer your phones or do things that are integral to your business, like if you hire a photo editor, an assistant, right? And they were working for you an hour or two a week on your main work, and this was kind of a habit, that's going to be more leaning towards employee to the IRS than a contractor. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. No, I
and people,
that.
Yeah. And there's a lot of misconceptions. If it's not that many hours, just like, here's another misconception. I don't know why I thought of it, that if you're a nonprofit, you can borrow and use people's copyrighted material because you're not necessarily making money on it, that somehow that's an exception to copyright law. So there's all these misconceptions out there. Yeah.
Wow. The last nonprofit one reminded me of a time. So, and this is kind of unrelated, but it's really funny.
Yeah, sorry, I kind of jumped there, but it sprung to mind.
No, I love it. There's a lot of, nonprofit spaces particularly churches, and we won't get into the ethics of this per se, but we'll get into just the law, will host like Super Bowl parties, and the NFL is not a fan of their product being reproduced in a location that is not paying that particular licensing fee or anything. Like a sports bar, they pay different packages for TV in order to achieve that. But the reply that I always heard as a kid was, well, who's going to sue a church? And and I think now with nonprofits and religious institutions alike, like anybody is open to being sued if they have broken the law.
No, you're right. And even the tiniest little mom and pop 4-chair little lunch counter restaurant, if they're, offering essentially a more or less a public performance of music or this and that, they could be caught and sued. It's just that, the enforcement doesn't always come around to do that. Now, the good news is increasingly they have simple, relatively cost-effective, licensing packages. But I'll tell you what, on those lines, one of the most interesting things I've heard is I know some folks in the suburbs who get together in a church and just play music. They bring some guitars and they play music, but they started drawing a little bit of a crowd. They did this once a month at the church, and they actually got a cease and desist and or pay a licensing fee letter from, it was either BMI, ASCAP, one of the collecting societies, if you will, that manage that. And that is probably the most extreme I've heard of. So yes, it is on their radar. Just like the kid that downloads pirates a bunch of movies, and all of a sudden mom gets hit with a multi-$100,000 lawsuit from Universal Studios, or it's out there.
Yeah, it's like the law at any time can be enforced. Just a matter of when the shoe drops, if you will. So right. The people that own those rights and or law enforcement, they go after the big fish first. The people in the warehouses cranking out bootleg movies by the hundreds. Obviously, they're after them first with limited resources. But it is what it is. That is so funny, man. We got off topic a little bit. What are maybe some other misconceptions about especially nonprofits? That's a kind of a good segue to go into that. Maybe think that, hey, we're a nonprofit, we can do whatever. I know maybe that's tax related or legality related.
Oh, sure. Well, nonprofits are interesting. So there are some fundamental differences, of course. Their tax treatment, with the IRS being the big one, the fact that they have a social mission. Now, that is being blurred increasingly by benefits corps or B corps that are relatively new, that say the idea there is, okay, it's a for-profit business, but you can consider things other than pure profit. So in the classic business, like a classic corporation, other than being legal and ethical, the only factor to consider in a merger or a buy-in or a buyout of these big transactions is shareholder value. Are you making money for the shareholder? But increasingly, that doesn't always fit with social or environmental concerns. And I'll give you 2 examples. One, I believe Etsy wanted to, if I remember correctly, in the past year or two, they wanted to spend more than they would otherwise to buy some environmentally sound for their company, shipping containers and things, not necessarily the merchants, but I think Etsy itself, if I remember the story correctly. And, under a regular model, one could say, well, yeah, you're going above and beyond and spending on those to help the environment or for a social purpose. That isn't really putting change in the shareholders' pockets. So let's not do that. So you would risk sort of that lawsuit of being off point. But increasingly you're finding, clearly in a nonprofit, but increasingly in these sort of hybrid for-profits, you're finding some latitude granted for that. Another thing is, although there's big differences in a nonprofit than a for-profit, some of the fundamentals are actually the same. Keeping good books, having your ducks in a row, reaching out and marketing. So I think there's a lot of perception out there. A few people out there think that maybe they don't know what a nonprofit is, the difference. But I think the bigger misconception is that a business and a nonprofit are so radically different, they share nothing in common.
Awesome. Kind of taking it back to something we talked about earlier. Tell me a little bit more about a copywriting for, even something like a business name. Is that necessary in this day and age? how easy is it to obtain? Worst case scenario, best case scenario. Is that best done through a business lawyer, or do you kind of just Google and go for it? And what would you say about, tell me a little bit more about copywriting, also versus a trademark, which I think is going to be a product versus a entity, but let me know.
Oh, yeah. And that is, a lot of that's not intuitive and can be confusing. So here's the thing. Patent applies to some folks, but I think a lot of the people that we're talking to, our audience, it's probably less applicable. The thing that's more often applicable are trade secrets, which people may not understand, copyright and trademark. Trade secrets are basically things you keep a secret that are valuable to your business. Customer list, pricing, process. So those you keep a secret and deal with your contracts and how you stamp things confidential. So those things, that's not really something you file. So then we'll narrow it down to copyright and trademark. And those are widely confused and used interchangeably. And there is some interplay and overlap, but they're distinct. So copyright, the purpose behind copyright is to protect creative works. Now, often it's done in the context of business, right? You have great photographs. But you use them in business, you may be able to sell them, whether it's to a particular client, whether it's to some awesome stock library, right? But it's hard. It's a creative work in the stream of business. So that's what copyright is best for. Things that are, bits of writing, articles, books, pictures, paintings, statues, etc. Trademark is really about the name and logo and sort of reputation of your business. And the thing that's widely misunderstood is that copyright and trademark, it's not that until you file with the government, you have zero rights in it. You do have some, but they're greatly, greatly enhanced when you file with the government. And some of those enhancements are you get national protection, let's say in the case of trademark, instead of just perhaps local protection, which is great if you ever want to expand, and you never know, right? You hope so. Another thing it does is it saves you, if you have to litigate an infringer, someone copying what you're doing or messing with you, so to speak, on that, you can save a lot of time, money, and steps in the litigation if you filed with the government. And in the case of copyright, you have to file in order to then sue. And then also, there's what they call actual damages and statutory damages. Actual damages means, you're suing for the actual amount you're out. You're saying, look, I lost this money because they're copying my work. That's great. But if you filed with the government and registered, you can get often what they call statutory damages, often triple. And what that means is however much you were actually damaged, you might be awarded a multiple of it. Right? That's pretty awesome. So there are some very powerful reasons. Also, registering tells people you're serious. And I would recommend an attorney's help. The reason being is, in the case of trademark in particular, you'll go awry if you ask for too little protection, right? Because there's different categories and classes. But if you ask for the moon, that doesn't really work either. So there's a lot of strategy. It's not intuitive. And quite frankly, the classifications haven't really caught up in some respects, I think, with 2016, even let alone 2017, the way products and services, especially digital and more innovative things. So sometimes you need a pro's help to shoehorn into what categories you're going to pick and to pick the wording. And it can matter. In fact, I read a stat recently from, I forget the source, but I believe it was a reliable source that said that 50% of trademark applications done without an attorney are rejected because something's missing, it's wrong, they didn't get the form right. And the problem with that is not only is that wasted time on your part, the $225 or more fee just that you paid the government, it's gone. You don't necessarily get a second chance to correct it if you get it wrong. So there's a lot of reasons to do it correctly the first time.
That's awesome. Go a little bit more with me. I know we talked about a little bit as far as, copywriting or trademarking the name of one's business. Is that more copyright or is that more trademark or both?
That's more trademark. And see, what people don't understand too is they think, one trademark filing protects everything. Trademark is a little bit like computer programming that's very literal in some ways. And what I mean by that is, one filing might be literally the word, the name of your business. Another one might be your logo with a name. Another one might be a slogan. And there's a lot of strategy and part of it's your budget, right? So for instance, a huge company like Apple, they might do 8, 10, 11 filings for one, just for their name and logo. In other words, they might do just Apple, then they might do just the Apple logo, then they might do Apple and the logo as a filing, then they might do a slogan. And they do every permutation, black and white, color, and that's the best way to protect your trademark and logo. But I help work with small businesses who usually don't have the budget to do, 7, 8, 10, 11 filings. The bang for the buck is in the first several. Some people have the budget to do one, which is better than none. Usually the biggest bang for the buck, in my opinion, is in the first 2 to 4 filings, permutations. But as you can see, maybe from this discussion already, it's not kind of buy a little primer or Google a few things and there you go.
Right. What about copyright? As far as I've heard other photographers copywriting their business name and stuff like that. Should they have trademarked, or do they just mean that they've trademarked it and they just said copywriting?
Yep, pretty much. Yeah, the terms get confused and used interchangeably. Anytime you're talking about your logo, your slogan, your business name, that's trademark. But photographers, the good news about copyright is the fee is much less than trademark, the government's fee. And in certain circumstances for photographers, let's say, this is perfect, they can let you do a bulk filing, so you can save on filing fees. And I could look up the number. I think it was as many as like $750 at once in some circumstances. It depends on the details. But the neat thing is, as opposed to, you don't have to pay a filing fee and do a separate filing for every photograph necessarily. So that's pretty awesome.
That is pretty awesome. Awesome, man. That's good insight. I know a lot of photographers, it's kind of like you said earlier, it adds a level of seriousness when you say, hey, we're gonna trademark this, we're gonna make this work, we're going to, we're putting our foot in the ground, if you will. And because I feel like in the digital infrastructure, well, yeah, you just go on Facebook and create a new page for your business, and you feel like you've done some kind of substantial thing, and that's really just not everything you need. I always advise people starting their business. I'm like, one, write everything down tax-wise. Start your bookkeeping now while you only do 2 to 4 transactions a month. 2, check with your business lawyer on your business plan, et cetera, and stuff like that. And then, 3, do you want to, make sure you have copyright or trademark? Because it's not necessarily that they forget about it when they start, but I say, how sad would you be if you found out you couldn't use that name?
Oh, absolutely. You're right. And bookkeeping is a perfect example, legal too, about trying to retrofit it later and shoehorn it in later can be a mess and expensive. And like I tell some folks, there's some mistakes I can't always fix. Usually I can fix the mistake. It's just going to, cost more and be more of a hassle. But occasionally there's a mistake I can't easily patch or fix. Not out of lack of skill or interest, just because, some things are hard to undo. One example that springs to mind on that is I knew someone that started a nonprofit using an LLC. So this is counterintuitive. You're going to be hard pressed on Google to find something crisply that says you can't use an LLC, because technically you can, but you're going to constantly have this distraction of why isn't it a corporation? And then you're going to have to do all these things for the IRS if you're a nonprofit that de facto make it a corporation. And you're going to have this awkwardness that it isn't. So there's things like that are not quick and easy to fix necessarily, or that aren't intuitive. Yeah.
Awesome. 2 last questions before we let you go. One, is there an appropriate time to register your business? I don't know if there's some kind of misconception about, hey, we should register at the beginning of the year, maybe to save on fees, or the end of the year, or the end of the fiscal year. And then secondly, my question is, what should somebody look for if they're a small business, 1 to 10 employees? What should they look for in a business lawyer?
Okay, let me tackle those real quick before I forget. Another thing I wanted to mention about intellectual property, like trademark and copyright, in particular trademark, is a lot of people don't know you have to be monitoring it. You can have a professional help, but someone needs to monitor it, because if you've let a lot of infringement kind of go downstream, or you've kind of abandoned it, and then you want to kind of pop up later and defend it, sometimes that's tricky. That isn't always, the way you can go. So you want to be consistent and kind of keep monitoring it out there. And that's another way a professional can help you. Sorry, I just wanted to add that tidbit before I forgot.
No, that's awesome. And we can even go on it just for a second is, kind of like if I think of, brothers or students and, one kid was doing something for a while that bugged the other, but they waited until the 10th occurrence to tell the teacher or tell the authority. And, there's other reasons for that, but it's like, hey, if we had told me the first time, or if you had been monitoring and documenting every single time that this was infringed, we might have a better, paper trail, substantial, kind of reasoning behind it, right?
Yeah. In fact, there's a term in trademark called genericide. And Coke, Kleenex, and Xerox are perfect examples. You ever heard somebody say, go Xerox that? Or I need buy some Kleenex, or go get some Coke. And what they really mean is soda, tissue, and photocopying. That brand, although unique in itself, right? Xerox, that was fairly, unique when it came out. But people, genericide is when a trade name becomes so commonly associated with the product that it doesn't necessarily have that distinctiveness anymore. Now, most tiny businesses aren't at that point, but that kind of ties into that whole idea. You have to be aware of what's going on with your mark. And every so many years, you have to touch base or file or pay again with the Patent and Trademark Office. You can't forget about it or abandon it. So it's not a once and done. You have to kind of maintain it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then let's go back to those two questions. So the first one was, kind of, is there an appropriate time of year or way to approach a business lawyer? And then secondly, what should people be looking for in a business lawyer or in counsel in general, really?
And as you can see, I love this stuff. I geek out on this stuff. I could talk about this all day, but I know we have limited time. When to get a lawyer or other advisors involved? Honestly, it's never too early. I shouldn't say that. If you're sitting around talking with friends or family or your partner or something and like, hey, what if I start a business? Okay, that might be too early. But once you have a concrete idea and you're really ready to take serious action on it, in other words, you don't have to wait till your first sale, and ideally you wouldn't. A lot of those things can be corrected or fixed if you've already jumped in, but ideally you would do it before you're advertising, before you hang your banner up, before your first sale. As far as a time of year, I don't know. Psychologically, it's kind of cool to do it at the beginning or the very end, and every jurisdiction's a little different on when you pay your annual fee. So there's no magic, day or time. Just talking to someone early is generally a good thing. It's hard to do it too early. Let's put it that way.
Definitely. And then what should people look for when they're looking for counsel or a business lawyer?
Obviously, you want to make sure their fee arrangements are a match for what you can do. I would say look for a fit and vibe, because even if there's several lawyers that can do the work, who's going to vibe with you and who gets you. I'm an entrepreneur and have studied design and done all these things. And, to relate to my tech clients, I've even taken up learning JavaScript and HTML and things just to relate to them better, not necessarily to become a hardcore developer. So find somebody that fits you think's kind of a kindred spirit and that you mesh well with, and don't be afraid to talk to a few. If you just don't get a good vibe, keep moving.
Awesome. Dude, well, thanks so much for being on the show, Skyler. If there's a place where people could maybe find you, reach out to you, what would be the best place to send them?
Sure. Well, they're welcome to contact me. My email is sshowell at showellvc as in VictorCharlie.com. So that's sshowl at shoalvc.com. And, I'd be happy to answer folks' questions or discuss it further. And around the DC area, you'll occasionally see me on panels talking about business law, entrepreneurship, things like that. So feel free to come out and say hi or catch me at one of those.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Skyler. Man, so good and such useful information from an expert. I love Skyler and I love his perspective on everything. He's just so knowledgeable. And even just in his answers, though, you kind of feel like, man, this is so complicated to do things right, which is very common in business. And a lot of times it just depresses people. So definitely reach out to him. Ask any questions. You can reach out to me if you have another question that you think like might be too little or too small for him, but really he's a great guy. The point of this episode, though, is to find a business lawyer that aligns with your business and knows your city and your place where you can start and what you're going to be doing. And don't be afraid to try. Reach out, find a great business lawyer or ask Skyler for a referral. And I feel like that's where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. And then also too, again, like he said, everything you do now will save you in the long run. So definitely do it now. I think when I first started, it was scary to spend like $1,000 on something. But if somebody sued me, or somebody took away my trademark or something like that, man, I would gladly pay $1,000 to save that stuff. The trick with that is $1,000 though is a lot easier to spend than the price of being sued or something like that. And so definitely reach out to Skyler from everything from entity like sole proprietorship or LLC or insurance, etc. He knows everything, so he can help out wherever you're at. So thank you so much for listening to the Bearded Tog podcast. It has been incredible. If you have a chance, send me an email with what you think so far. How are we doing? And what would you like to see in the future? We've got a lot of episodes on the way, and hopefully some more fiery ones, kind of like the imposter syndrome one. And I would just love to know what's resonating with you guys. So send me an email, thebeardedtog@gmail.com, and I'll reply. Promise you. So send me an email. What do you think? Leave a review on iTunes. Thanks so much. Have a great day, guys.